I live in a fairly nice suburban neighborhood in a small town. Like most suburban communities, we have a homeowners association, HOA. For those unfamiliar, HOAs are typically filled with people who like to micromanage every little detail about how homes are maintained and how people behave in the community. It's a mixed bag of decent people and, well, people like Karen. Karen, for context, is one of those overbearing, self-righteous people who seems to think she runs the entire neighborhood. She's the type to get upset over a single blade of grass being an inch too long or a mailbox being slightly tilted. She always insists that she's just trying to keep the neighborhood nice and that everyone else should follow her strict rules. In reality, though, she's just an entitled busybody who enjoys making people's lives difficult. I've had a couple of run-ins with her in the past, but nothing serious. Just the usual HOA nonsense. She once scolded me for having too many potted plants on my porch, but I brushed it off. Still, I could tell she was the kind of person who would go to great lengths to enforce her version of what's appropriate. One day I came home from work and parked my car in what is technically a visitor parking spot, which is located near my house. Now I know it's meant for guests, but it's an empty spot, and I wasn't going to drive all the way to the back of the neighborhood just to park for the night. It's not like I do this every day, but this time it was convenient. Of course, Karen had to see me park there. She was walking her dog, and she immediately stopped to glare at me. She marched up to my car, knocked on my window, and started berating me for parking in a spot meant for guests only. I calmly told her that I was just parking for the night and I wasn't taking up the spot long term. But Karen wasn't having any of it. She insisted that I was breaking HOA rules and that she would report me to the association. I'm not one to back down from someone like her, so I told her, "Go ahead, Karen. It's not against the rules for me to park here for a few hours." But she didn't let it go. Karen was absolutely furious. She stood there arguing with me, telling me I was disrespecting the neighborhood and that she was in charge of making sure things were done properly. She even went so far as to accuse me of trespassing because apparently in Karen's world, parking in a visitor spot for a few hours was a crime. At this point, I wasn't going to argue further, so I just rolled up my window and ignored her. But Karen wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and started dialing, shouting into it that she was calling the police because I was illegally parked and refusing to move. I thought she was bluffing at first, but nope, she wasn't. A few minutes later, a cop car pulled into the neighborhood. I saw Karen standing by the street, frantically waving her arms like she'd just called in an emergency. To my surprise, though, the cop that stepped out of the car wasn't just any officer. It was my brother, who is the local sheriff. I'll admit I was a little nervous at first. I didn't want to cause any drama, and I was wondering how he'd handle this whole thing. But as soon as he saw me, he raised an eyebrow. Then he turned to Karen, who was still ranting about how I was breaking the law by parking in the visitor spot. My brother's really chill and doesn't get involved in family matters unless it's absolutely necessary, but he could see where this was going. He asked Karen what the issue was, and she immediately started rattling off her complaint about illegally parked cars and how people like me need to follow the rules. Now Karen had no idea that the officer was my brother. She didn't know I was related to anyone in law enforcement. She kept talking like she had the upper hand, but my brother wasn't buying it. He politely asked her to calm down and explain exactly what the illegal situation was, but Karen was too caught up in her rant to make much sense. My brother, being the professional that he is, asked if there was any ordinance in the community that prohibited parking in the visitor spot for a few hours. Karen fumbled for a second. She couldn't provide anything concrete because, as I had told her, there was no such rule. He then turned to me and asked if I'd been parking there regularly or if I had any intention of leaving the car there long term. I answered truthfully, I was just parking for a few hours while I unpacked and rested after a long workday. My brother nodded and turned back to Karen. At that point, Karen finally realized that she had made a massive mistake. My brother looked at her with an almost amused expression. "Ma'am, you've made a report based on something that isn't even illegal. I suggest you don't waste any more of the police's time with complaints like this." Karen's face went from bright red to pale in a matter of seconds. She realized that she had just tried to get someone arrested over something petty and that she had been barking up the wrong tree. My brother made it very clear that her call was a complete waste of resources. He told her that if she continued to make false reports like this, she could face consequences for wasting police time. She stammered something about how she was just trying to protect the community. But my brother wasn't having it. If you want to protect the community, try following the actual rules and not inventing new ones. After a few awkward seconds of silence, Karen left in a huff, muttering about how this wasn't over and she'd be talking to the HOA about it. My brother just shrugged, and we both shared a knowing look. Karen didn't escalate things further, likely because she realized how bad she looked in front of the authorities. I later found out from some of my neighbors that she'd been gossiping about how someone was breaking HOA rules and how she almost had them arrested, but nobody really took her seriously after that. It didn't end up being a big deal in the long run. I never heard anything from the HOA, and as far as I know, Karen's complaint didn't go anywhere. But I did enjoy watching her walk away with her tail between her legs, especially knowing that she had just embarrassed herself in front of the sheriff. When Karen realized she had completely messed up, she walked away, but she was fuming. She was still angry and clearly embarrassed about how things had gone down. She muttered something like, "This isn't over, and I'll be talking to the HOA about this." But she quickly disappeared down the street, defeated. For a moment, OP was just in a bit of shock, but then they thanked their brother for stepping in. The two shared a quiet laugh before heading back into the house. Though OP thought the issue was finished, Karen wasn't quite done making a scene. She went around telling anyone who would listen about how she had almost had someone arrested for illegal parking. She claimed she was just trying to protect the community and that she had almost called the cops on a blatant violator. But as it turns out, Karen's story didn't exactly win her any fans. Neighbors who overheard her complaints knew that Karen had a history of overreacting and stirring up drama. Most people just rolled their eyes and brushed it off as another one of her wild stories. For a few days, OP didn't hear anything official from the HOA about the incident, which was a relief. It seemed like Karen's complaint didn't go anywhere. The HOA might have realized that Karen was making mountains out of molehills and that there was no actual violation. OP realized that if they had parked anywhere else in the neighborhood, Karen probably would have found some other reason to complain. But in the end, they didn't have to deal with any fallout from the HOA. It was as if the whole issue just fizzled out. In the weeks following, Karen's reputation took a hit. The other neighbors started to notice that she was becoming a bit of an outcast. People didn't want to deal with her in her obsession with enforcing rules that didn't really matter. The incident with the police only reinforced her image as someone who would cause a fuss over the smallest thing. It was pretty clear that Karen had damaged her own standing in the neighborhood. Instead of being seen as a respectable HOA member, she was now viewed as an overbearing, self-appointed rule enforcer who overreacted to trivial issues. For OP, the whole experience became a funny story they could tell. They joked with their brother about how, if Karen had known who he was, she might have thought twice about calling the cops. But in the end, OP was glad their brother had been there to handle things with calm professionalism. It was also a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself when someone abuses their power can really pay off. OP didn't back down, and it turned out that Karen's attempt to flex her HOA authority only made her look ridiculous. Abusing authority backfires. Karen tried to use her self-appointed authority to control the situation, but it ended up backfiring, leaving her embarrassed. Neighborhood politics. OP learned that as long as they weren't doing anything wrong, standing up to HOA rules being enforced in a heavy-handed way was the right move. Karma comes for you. Karen's attempt to have OP arrested for something trivial ended up making her look like the villain. Her overreaction cost her the respect of the neighbors.